At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. Well, hello and welcome to another Drug Science Podcast. I'm David Nutt, and tonight with me I have one of the true greats of the psychedelic space. A man who was there at the very beginning and still here now and still pioneering research and developments in this field. His name will be familiar to all of you. He's Jim Fadiman. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. And it's wonderful that you and I are connecting because we overlap in so many areas, but we actually haven't had much time to talk to one another.
No, you helped me out with the review of Microdosing, and that was very, very helpful. We published a couple of years ago. But I want to get to microdosing a bit later, a bit like you, really. I want to start at the beginning, and I want you to tell me and the listeners about your beginnings, because I'm not sure many people know about them.
Well, many, many years ago, when psychedelics were basically unknown, except that Sandoz Pharmaceuticals was desperately trying to figure out how they could commercialize this peculiar chemical.
Mm-hmm.
I met my undergraduate mentor, Richard Alpert, in Paris, where I was living. And he said to me, the greatest thing in the world has happened to me, and I want to share it with you. And I thought, well, that sounds like a pretty nice offer. I said, okay. And then he reached in his breast pocket and came out with a little vial of pills. And I thought, what is going on? I was so straight that I didn't drink coffee. Although I was living in Paris, I did have a bit of wine, but very seldom. And here was someone offering me some kind of pill for something. However, I decided that my mentor probably knew what he was doing. And so we sat in a cafe on the Boule Miche and I had some psilocybin and Richard didn't. And after a while, the colors improved. The whole ambiance felt quite lovely. And I was paying attention to the conversation of people walking behind me, as you would in a cafe. You hear all this conversation. And then I had this moment where I realized I didn't speak French well enough to understand them. But tonight I was understanding. That was my first revelation that something odd was going on. And it got a little more intense. I think we now call it coming up. And I said to Richard, this is really too much for me. And he says, too much for me too. I said, well, you didn't take anything. He says, it's my first night in Paris. So we withdrew to my fifth floor walk-up. Let us say I was living on the thrifty side of things. And by the end of the long evening or the long night, I had begun to relax certain of my very core beliefs. Now, in retrospect, and because we use these terms more clearly, this was a moderate dose of psilocybin. This was not very much. However, he was on his way to Copenhagen to meet up with Tim Leary and Aldous Huxley, and they were presenting the first major presentation about their work to the World Congress of Psychologists. So I showed up. Nobody asked me. I left Paris and went to Copenhagen. I was following this track and had another evening with Richard, and again, let go of some belief systems, but also came to the position they were in, which was that this was an experience of enormous bonding, and that one would do anything for someone else in this relationship, but one also wouldn't ask for anything that would be inappropriate. So it's a kind of, I'll do anything for you, but you're not going to ask for anything too hard. And we parted and went on our way, and life went on, and I met someone in Scotland a few weeks later, who later became a fiance because I was really quite open and lovely. and ended up as a first-year graduate student at Stanford University. The alternative life position would have been to go to Vietnam. My choice would have been to stay in Paris as long as I possibly could. So I was an inadvertent graduate student, and at Stanford, there was a group, or actually near Stanford in the city of Menlo Park, there was a little group called the International Foundation for Advanced Study. Myron Stolaroff, Willis Harman, other people that are in the history. And they said, why don't you have a session with us? And I thought, oh, a lovely bonding event. And I showed up and took probably 200 micrograms of LSD. And after a while, I was not interested in bonding. I was interested in lying back on the couch and putting on an eye shade and hearing music. And that changed most of my life. That changed my belief systems about the nature of self, the nature of identity, probably the nature of time and space. And when I returned to being Jim Fadiman, it was with real puzzlement, is why I was back, having been out beyond my identity, why I had returned to being this first-year graduate student, which seemed to be a terribly worthless place to be if one was going to inform the world of the possibilities of these substances.
So you were an undergraduate in doing, not specializing. You met Alpert as an undergraduate, yes?
I did the only dissertation Stanford allowed about psychedelics. Stanford was a little terrified at becoming like the Harvard of the West, where they just fired Tim Leary and Dick Alpert, and it was a big scandal. So suddenly my work became something we didn't want to talk about.
Right. But then you went back as a graduate student to do a PhD in psychology or in?
Well, I was informed that if I did a dissertation on psychedelic therapy, which is what I did, that I would never have a decent academic career. And that was pretty much true, and I'm very, very grateful for that. But I did end up filling in for Abraham Maslow, who had just been the president of the American Psychological Association for a year at Brandeis as a teacher in psychology, and that worked well for Brandeis and for myself, except that this was not my culture. These were not my people. And I came west with my wife and a child and no job. And my career unfolded from that. So I really did some teaching. I did some university work. I actually taught in design engineering at Stanford for a number of years, part-time. But I've always been maintaining the implications of that October 19th, 1961 event, which shifted my awareness of the possibilities for human beings. And so that's the work that I'm still doing. In the last 10 years or so, I've been working with microdosing, which is the tiniest amounts of psychedelics you can imagine. And that's a totally different realm. It's kind of on at least American radio, there's AM and there's FM, and there are different sets of frequencies, and they have very different programming. And that's a poor analogy for what my last 10 years have been.
Well, we'll come back to that, as I say, later. But let's go back to the beginnings, because you pioneered the idea of, I think, of psychedelics and problem solving and creativity. Can you tell us about?
We were running basically a little clinic, a really outpatient clinic. We had permission from the government to do that. And then Willis Harman and I were talking, and he felt that psychedelics could be used for hard science problems. And it didn't make a lot of sense because people were taking psychedelics at the level we were giving it and losing interest, let alone in their problems, in their career or in their physical being. And it seemed a little bizarre that we could do this. However, and this is not in the literature, what we really did is we got together, four of us, and we took a lower dose, probably 50 micrograms. And as a group, we tried to design the study to see if groups like ours could basically set up a problem-solving research study. And what we found is that we did a pretty good job. And we also found that working as a small group was not going to work very well. So we ended up designing a study where we had individuals who were senior scientists and who had, to get into this study, you had to have a problem that you had been working on for several months and had not made progress. You had basically failed.
Yep.
Now, these were people with a very, very small amount of failure in their careers. These were very successful people. And our reasoning was that in order to keep people interested in their problem, their science problem, they had to have an emotional component. They had to care.
Yep. Yep.
And so they had to care to, in a sense, recover some of their self-esteem. So that was how you got into our study. And through Willis Harman and some others, we really were in touch with senior scientists. And what we just said is, this is an opportunity for you to work on your hardest problem. And we think it'll be very successful. So we were also setting up a setting or placebo generating, if one likes that kind of term, situation where they would be likely to be successful. And so we also gave them some psychological tests or tests in the literature, quote, for creativity. And we tried to pick tests that were known to be extraordinarily stable, meaning you could take them every 5 years and your score wouldn't change. So we were looking at things which the psychological community felt were givens in the system, in your own mental system. So we did that. And as one newspaper many years later said, 48 problems, 44 solutions. We had patents, we had products, we had publications come out of this. And probably most remarkably, with one exception, people did not go into their personalities, did not go into the geometrics or the beauties of but actually looked forward to working on their problems. And again, we did a little bit of research, and they indicated that their creativity maintained at a higher level for the next few months. So that was the study, and it's really not been replicated in the scientific literature. It's been replicated endlessly, certainly in Silicon Valley. At one point, if one looked around and said, of you 100 heads of corporations in Silicon Valley, how many of you owe one of your major insights for the products you're now making to your own psychedelic investigations? And the answer would have been 20 or 30 of those hands would have been raised. So it became quite well known that psychedelics influence creativity. It faded away in the scientific world because only people who worked illegally were allowed to take psychedelics for the next, 40, 50 years until now.
I want to come back to that in a minute because, it's remarkable that, you were there, you saw it changing. But before I do that, let me just talk a little bit, because you didn't just use psychedelics, did you? You also, I think, sometimes use mephedrine or other stimulants to promote.
No, well, we used either LSD or mescaline. And this was literally depending on what the government agency who was bothering us about. So we literally, after a while, we basically could cross dose to have approximately the same effect.
Right.
With the creativity study, most of it was mescaline. Oh, we did not, with our clinical patients, we sometimes would add some kind of an energizer.
Yeah, that's the term you used. Yes, I remember.
During the early part of the day, simply because this was a very, very intense and tiring day. And we also offered people sleeping medication, again, offer a long clinical day, much higher dose, and very few people took it. With our science people, that didn't happen at all. And almost without exception, what they said is, I kept going on the things that I'd been working on in the afternoon, and I got to bed at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
And I was very happy.
So there's always this interesting question about what determines the nature and the direction of people's psychedelic experiences. And you're saying if people have got a serious problem, they'll go in there and they'll keep, the problem will become the center of their being, of their experience. And
well, it's a set and setting question. So if you look at, say, the PTSD research, from the first day people want to enter the study, they're focused on their mental illness and their pre-work not with a trainer and not with a coach, but with a therapist. And they are urged during the session to think about the traumas that are, we think now, caught in the amygdala instead of being part of the brain memory system and so forth. And so those studies are highly focused on getting the results they're interested in. And when people actually wander away from, in the therapy sessions, from material that is therapeutically valuable, they're brought back. We basically set it up so that these people were eager to work on science problems. So, not surprisingly, and we didn't have the cultural background. Remember, nobody much knew what psychedelics were capable of. And we were using a dose where you maintain your identity. And once you've maintained your identity, then the issues that interest you are those that interest your identity. If you're doing something therapeutic, what we know is it's healthier to let go of your identity so that you can see that your problems are a much smaller part of your total being. That's a very different mindset. So the creativity study was a combination of extreme set and setting. We had them in the night before in groups of 4, and they would very briefly tell each other what problems they were working on. In our session room, we actually had 4 people going at once. They just didn't talk to each other. And at the end of the day, again, they would chat, because these, again, were often people who knew each other, and they were people who loved science. And the range of problems was from architectural design, designing a set of buildings, to a new theory of the photon.
Oh,
so
right.
Wide range. And the theory of the photon one did get published.
And was it correct?
Well, that's why we call them theories.
Yes, right.
But I went through probably the most, and I've never really understood this one myself, but Willis describes it in a BBC interview some years later, is a number of people were interested in circuit design. This was the beginning of the computer age.
Yep.
And one person would set up in his mind a mental experiment where he would lay out a circuit board. And then in his mind, he would run electricity through it. And in his mind, he would see where it failed. And then he would, in his mind, replace that part or change the wire or change the voltage. And then he would run electricity through it again in his mind to see. Now, what's fascinating about that, he was clearly setting up a situation in which he and the rest of the universe had no pre-knowledge of what would work or what would not. But he was able to run experiments as if they were totally physical in his mind. So I leave that to my neuroscientist friends who wish I wouldn't bring up things like this.
No, it's remarkable. And it was that from those experiments, then you went on to work with Engelhardt in this Augmentation Research Center, is that right?
Well, Doug Engelbart was one of our subjects. And that came because I was actually consulting to his project. And Doug Engelbart is the person who invented the mouse, but he invented the mouse only as a tool because he was inventing the idea, and it's, again, hard for us to get, we didn't always think this way, to have the computer work with words. Before Engelbart, computers were things that could generate curves which would match an equation. So it was incredibly radical that you could use computers not only to record words, but to move them around and all the things. Cut and paste was invented by Engelbart.
Right.
So I was a consultant to that project, which is a whole other wild part of my life.
Well, tell us about it. This is a great opportunity. I've only just learned about it from briefing myself and you.
There was near Stanford University, there was a research institute called the Stanford Research Institute, SRI. And it basically took in clients, government, commercial, etc., and said, we'll invent things for you, we will solve problems, we will do research studies, we will do surveys. We're kind of a science little market. And one of the projects was the Engelbart project called Augmenting Human Intellect. What Engelbart's fantasy was, and again, you have to get that at this point, I'm in now a room the size of a 2-car garage. The computer that Doug had to work with would fill this room. His vision was that on your desk, there would be a computer, and that computer would connect you to a great deal of human knowledge. That was his wild, far-out fantasy, and he was deeply ridiculed by most of the computer profession.
Really?
And he found one little area of the federal government, somebody who believed in him, who funded the beginnings of this, the creation of the mouse. The first one was made from a little wood block, and so forth. And so in the time I was consulting with that group, they had what is now called in the computer history the mother of all demos. And it was a demonstration of word processing, of cut and paste, of a number of things. And it was done at a very, very large national computer conference. The Engelbart's place was about 30 miles from San Francisco. They literally ran a telephone line, a physical line, from the laboratory to the computer group. And Doug appears on a very large screen, which we're now very used to, with a mouse and talking, and the split screen shows what's happening. This really transformed the computer industry. And a number of brilliant, complicated early computer people ended up working with Doug. And one in particular, I remember, Charles Irby, he was at that demo, and wherever he was doing, I believe, graduate work or postgraduate work, he showed up the next day at SRI. And he said, I want to work with this group. We said, we don't have any openings. He said, I'll wait. And the next day he was in the lobby. And the next day he was in the lobby. And he became a very, very core member of the team. So that team, if one looks at kind of history of Silicon Valley with all those little lines of where you worked and so forth, these people were an important set of resources for Silicon Valley. But it came out of Engelbart's personal vision of that a personal computer was a possibility.
Do you think was the vision in any way encouraged or even seeded by psychedelics? Could we claim the computer as a...
I'm always sorry that Doug had already invented the mouse by the time he came to the group. I would say that the vision was fairly solid, and Doug's being part of the creativity group moved parts of it along, because also his second in command, William English, also was part of that group. And by that time, they had lots and lots of problems, but the basic structure was there. And they were, in a sense, waiting for the computer industry to move from the room size. And in a demonstration, in a discussion at Stanford, like 30 years later, kind of major celebration of this demo, the person running the event said, this holds more computer power than Engelbart had in his laboratory. And 24 people were running off of that computer. And you'll get why I was asked to be part of this. Why is a psychologist part of this?
Yeah, quite. Tell us why.
They were all using a computer language that they were writing. Okay. Now, we don't see it as much anymore, but computers crash. And if you're writing a program and you're working that program to write the next piece of it, the chances of a crash go way up. And the level of technology was such. So you have 20 people working on 20 computers, 20 monitors. They're all working on the same language. And if anyone crashes, everyone crashes. Okay? Now, these are not people who are socially adept. These are people who are wonderful and brilliant and did not go into computers out of social graces. So I was there in part to prevent people from harming one another. And how could you develop systems of working where you actually were trusting that your day's work would not be destroyed at any given instant by the person next to you, and vice versa. So that was one of the very interesting issues that I was asked to help on. The other problem was that Doug Engelbart,
staggering,
certified genius in lots of ways, he tended to communicate with little sketches and assumptions that you somehow would have understood him if you knew a lot more, which meant he didn't communicate terribly well. And I would go into these meetings, and Doug would be presenting something, and people would be talking. And in all candor, as a psychologist, I had no idea what anyone was talking about. But I was very sensitive to when people stopped understanding one another. And so I would interrupt and suggest that perhaps something needed to be clarified. And working with Doug was really the same way, as he would, in a sense, run the ideas through me to see if they were understandable. So it was a fascinating, one of the most interesting consultings of my career. And computers and psychedelics became interwoven later on, but not at this point.
Here he is. Hello, Jim.
Thank you, James. Yes, that was what we would call in those days a crash, when we just lost communication with each other. I went on talking perhaps into empty space, and here we are again. So the technology has improved so that we can recover from crashes much more easily.
Right. So, Jim, you were saying to me, you were saying, why did they need a psychologist? And then you started to explain to me they needed a psychologist because all these 19 people, whatever, were working off the same computer. They were all writing their own programs, and the computer would crash. And at that moment, your computer crashed. But now you're back.
Okay, well,
so why don't you finish that anecdote?
I appreciate the universe having its own little joke, but if you wouldn't mind, no more crashes. Basically, they had to get along at a level that teammates usually don't, because they were working on the same language. They were using a language to create more of the same language. And if one computer crashed, everyone in the group lost their work.
Oh, right.
So this was a very difficult time. And then at night, there was people that came in and worked with the giant computer saving material. So this was we would now call this an amazingly large but primitive system. And this was run as part of a network with military systems and some university systems. And the first communication between two groups, meaning not in the next room, but in the next state. This was the group that first did computer-to-computer communication. So they did a lot of the breakthroughs that we now assume, or we have no idea that anyone ever worked without them.
But you were the psychologist making it all run smoothly. Is that what you're saying?
No, I was the psychologist. Psychologist who was there to make sure that people both cooperated and helped each other as best they could. But also, when communications broke down, it's not necessarily clear to people what went on or who's not understanding whom. Just as we had this crash, unbeknownst to any of you who will ever see this, I went on talking for several minutes, somewhat oblivious that we had crashed, going over some of this material. And so David and I were no longer in any kind of rapport, but we were in this situation. There's no way out. This is the time we have to do this program. So I was the person who often would deal with people who had lost it in some way, as well as deal with the simple question of moving technology from here to here is not that easy.
Jim, let me just explain to the listeners what you've just done. When he said here, he was pointing to his brain.
Right.
And when he said the second here, he was pointing to the keyboard, I think.
Yeah. And that's a very large gap.
Yes.
And particularly when no one's ever done it. So that was the group. And it was a remarkable group. And some people did actually have, I wouldn't say a mental breakdown, but a mental breakout. One of the group ended up running for governor of Nevada, the one state over, on a religious platform. And that came not from working on the computer, but from his own experiments with LSD, which was now coming into the culture illegally.
I see. Well, I want to ask you about that. I mean, given that you were there at the beginning and you saw the enormous potential and value, 44 out of 48 senior scientists, academics, architects solving problems. You must have been so positive, and then you saw it all fall apart. What's your take on what went wrong?
Well, nothing went wrong on our side. We had what was called an investigational exemption, meaning these substances were not for sale, but the government freely gave research exemptions. And at the time we were doing our study, there were perhaps 60 different research projects, people giving LSD to fish and to mice and to autistic children and to other clinical studies. When I entered it, 1961, I asked Sandoz, I don't know, I didn't know any better. I wrote Sandoz and said, is there any other research about psychedelics? And I received 2 large volumes, and that was the abstracts only of the first 1,000 studies. So at this time, LSD was the most studied research psychiatric drug on the planet. So there was a lot of interest, okay? And we were just doing our research, and we got a letter from the federal government that said, as of the receipt of this letter, your research is canceled. What? No reason, no discussion. And at the time we got the letter, there were 4 senior scientists in our treatment room with headphones. And in an hour or so, they would take off their headphones and they would start to work on their problems. And the federal government said, your research is canceled. Now, I was the junior member here. I'm the graduate student. And I looked at my colleagues and I said, I think we got this letter tomorrow.
Yes.
We did. And our research then ended, not for any, and all the other 60 projects had the same letter. So the government wasn't, they were paying attention to what we were doing, but we were kind of, it's kind of like if you have a load of firewood and you're going to put it all in the fire and you have one little beetle there and you're the beetle, you get thrown in the fire and anything you did. So the research, the formal research ended, but as I've said, the notion that psychedelics could be helpful in science escaped the laboratory, as we might say, and became part of the technological revolution, as true in England as is true in the United States.
But it was the US that drove the ban, drove the making these drugs illegal. What was your take on it at the time? Did you understand what was going on?
At the time, we really had no idea, because it was the most researched drug on the planet. Sandoz was 100% supportive. There were other interesting works going on. And we were seeing, obviously, as a little clinic, we were seeing some wonderful healing breakthroughs. And suddenly the government did what it did. Now, we now know historically, it never had anything to do with science. It never had anything to do with the effects of psychedelics. President Nixon didn't like various groups who didn't like him. And that included hippies, it included blacks, it included various groups. Particularly didn't like anti-war groups, which all of these groups used either psychedelics or marijuana. And we have this recorded from one of his assistants who said, we were looking for a way, we couldn't just go arrest people for being hippies or being anti-war. However, if we could make what they were using illegal, we could then infiltrate them, we could break them up, we could do all the kinds of things that government does when it decides to attack an enemy. And that's basically what happened. Now, the curious part is, because none of us knew this, a great many scientists and legislators then decided, well, if it's illegal, then must be bad, because the government doesn't do foolish, irrational things. So if it's bad, what might it be bad about? And then we have this whole mythology of how various problems that psychedelics cause. Now, one of the things we know is psychedelics, and we know that because of a famous paper written by David Nutt, okay, that these are the safest substances out there. So what we ended up with was a great deal of pseudoscientific nonsense created by perfectly nice people who were trying to second guess why the government would make something illegal. And there we are. And so we're still just unwinding that. And we're now, of course, in what's called a psychedelic renaissance. I'd say more it's a psychedelic recovery.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. You're right. Yes.
Well, because so much of the research now going on is replicating research that we already done. So when someone says, oh my God, psychedelics reduce depression. And I think, yeah.
Yeah.
We do that 60 years ago. Now, they said, but you didn't use a double blind. And I said, well, we didn't have any funding. You try doing a double blind without funding, and you'll find that they're much too expensive. And when you're doing research to find out what you already know, it's pretty easy to design the research. Now, right now, I think we're getting into genuinely different research. But for a lot of the research that has been the core of the Renaissance, has been catching back up to where we were in the mid 60s.
But so, Jim, that must have had a huge impact on your career. What did you do? Was there, when you, after that letter, the day after, what did you do the day after?
Well, oh my goodness, the day after, I thought, well, I've been told that if I do my dissertation, which I just done, on psychedelics, I'll never get an academic job. And I thought, so I was fine. I was working with psychedelics. And then they said, well, and you can't work with psychedelics either. Okay. And I have a wife and I have a child. And I looked around for other things to do. And I finally realized if I had learned something about consciousness and about culture and about a lot of things through my psychedelic research, then perhaps I had either some skills or some abilities that the culture could use. So I ended up working with a small consulting firm that had 4 psychologists, and one of them had a Ford Foundation grant to go work in Africa for a year. Now, he happened to have been someone who knew about our research, and we had actually worked with him. And so he said to me, I have some clients, my consulting clients, would you like to work with them? I said, in essence, under my breath, you mean a real job and I get paid? Oh, I'm very interested in your clients. Now, his clients was a wonderful melange for me to learn things. It was a number of nursing schools in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, Foster's Freeze, which is a soft ice cream franchise.
Yep.
And there were 2 others. And also AT and ITT, which were one of the first conglomerates. They had 150 companies, and I was asked to look at senior executives who were interested in high jobs entering that system. So I had everything from the Foster's Freeze people, through the nurses, to senior executives, and so I was gifted as a start of my career, seeing if my understanding of consciousness could cross a lot of kind of occupational lines, and it did well enough. And then I was offered a job at Brandeis for a year, teaching, filling in for Maslow, and my career went. My children have said that the hardest question they were ever asked as children is, what does your father do? Because I really had part-time jobs for most of my career, a number of them.
But you still carried on writing about psychedelics?
Well, I carried on, but not very well. I was not one of the determined underground.
No.
I did not know at that point the major underground chemists. And one of the chemists, by the way, just so we have a little bit of what went on, one of the chemists has said, and it's quite true, he said, we made 100 million doses of LSD. And then he went on to say he thought that made the world a better place. But this was one of the chemists. So when LSD was made illegal at the top, it proliferated at the bottom. And just look at the United States, and I don't know the British figures, but since LSD became illegal, now we're just talking about LSD, not psilocybin, not ecstasy, so forth, just LSD, 36 to 40 million Americans have taken LSD since it became illegal. And if we run that against education, we're talking mainly people in the top 50% of education.
Yes.
So when the Renaissance started, it, instead of meeting both kind of ignorance and government opposition, it met a whole generation of people who were quite sure that the official government position was not based on science, and their own personal experience suggested that psychedelics probably had a whole lot of advantages. And that's where we are. And I think that's one of the reasons that the research until now, all of the research, again, in the States, has been privately funded. This is now, from 2006 to now, has been privately funded. Now, why do you privately fund psychedelic research? Is because you believe that there's some value. We now have just the first moment where the federal government has funded a clinical study. So that didn't happen in the 60s. We didn't have that huge support base.
Yes. So, Jim, let's get on to what most people know you for and what you're famous for, which is flying the flag for microdosing. So Tell us about how you got into that, and is it an extension of what you were doing at the beginning, or what?
My interest in psychedelics has always been, or had always been, high end, high dose. As far as I'm concerned, if you're not discovering that you're transcendent, that your identity is a subset of you, that you may not have been born and you may not ever die, those kinds of things, I was not really very interested. And so the universe said, well, how about let's play a little joke? How about if we interest you in the absolute other end, where instead of working with 400 micrograms, you're working with 10? And I said, well, who would care about that? Whatever it was. And a friend of mine said that Albert Hoffman had used these very low doses and had said that if Sandoz had paid attention to him, there would never have been a market for Ritalin or for Adderall. So
Okay,
it was a very
interesting.
curious
Yeah.
question. And my friend suggested, this is Robert Forte, Forte, that I look into microdosing. And truly, my interests were, who cares? But I can tell you the definition of microdosing
I understand.
is no psychedelic effects, no visions, no choirs of angels, no finding your hand turning into a bunch of flowers and then a snake, no 9-foot anacondas eating you alive, and no incredible breakthroughs psychotherapeutically in terms of insights. That's a microdose, which it doesn't have that. And what it does seem to have is a remarkable capacity to help the body restore its equilibrium. And I'm using the generalization very deliberately because there are a great many conditions which are the body in disequilibrium. A lot of mental illness and a lot of physical illness. And microdosing seems to be somehow supports a return to balance. And that's quite, and has turned out to be quite remarkable. And so I got in.
Yeah, I mean, you're clearly the prophet.
Well, my interest is, since I wasn't, just as I didn't have an academic career, I also wasn't going to be having a research career. But I was a curious person. So I would say to people, microdosing might interest you. If you do that, let me know what you experience. And so people would say, well, I don't know. I said, wait, would you be willing to write that down and send it to me? So I began to accumulate little reports. And that now, with the help of my colleague who joined me, Sophia Korb, we ended up with maybe 1,500 to 2,000 sets of reports. And we added a daily check-in list. And we ended up with a mass of data from 51 countries about how people themselves were using microdoses. We recommend, and if you go to our site, microdosingpsychedelics.com, it simply says, here are the dosage levels that people have found beneficial. So our research has been passive. We've suggested safety and efficacy, but the reports that have come in have been generated entirely by people working on their own.
Sort of conduit through which individual experiences can get into a kind of public consciousness.
Yeah, that's a nice way of saying it, which is, and then of course we then turn around, and what we've said in our cover letter is, if you tell us how it works for you, we can then answer questions that other people with your condition will tell us. And that cycle keeps going and is going even as I'm sitting here. There's some remarkable cases happening, and I'm getting some reports. And there are now other groups who have done similar kinds of surveys, and we're beginning to share information about the problem for microdoses. Is it seems to help too many conditions, and that scientifically is always suspect unless you change your paradigm. If we're talking of pharmaceuticals are designed for as tight a focus as possible. That's just a business model. Vitamins, we assume, affect the whole body. Microdoses seem to work more like vitamins than pharmaceuticals. That's just an observation, not a proof.
It's a very good analogy. And have you ever been pestered, or do the FDA or the feds? Have you ever had any trouble with the establishment?
It's like we're kind of ignored out to the side. I mean, here we have thousands of cases, and what I love is I read someone that says, well, Microdose research is anecdotal. And I think anecdotal means somebody told you something. And I thought, well, what happens in a laboratory study, say you're studying smoking cessation, and you say to people, how much are you smoking? And they say 2 packs a day. And then they go through the whole process. And several months later, you say, how many cigarettes are you smoking? They say 1 every 2 weeks. That's not an anecdote because they were told it inside of a research project. But if someone writes me weekly and tells me that their thyroid is no longer causing them, their low thyroid is no longer causing them fatigue, I think that's as good a data as the other. Because what it says is, why don't we look at, because wait a moment, psychedelics, thyroid, let me do a quick scan of the literature since we now have databases. There is nothing. Well, wait a moment, there is something. There's one case. Now, in other sciences, think biology, think astronomy, one case suggests that there's something there, and you get very excited. I mean, you read a National Geographic thing and it says, I went to the jungles of Java and I found one plant that nobody had seen before. And everybody says, that's a whole, that now exists. We know that plant exists on the world. We could cultivate that plant. We could do all kinds of it. So it's very important to realize that your tools often restrict your thinking. And the wonderful thing about what we now call citizen science is people don't know what the limits are, and they discover things you would never imagine looking for.
It's a new paradigm, isn't it? And it's completely the opposite of what, as you pointed out, has happened in medicine. Is it's become so commercial, and
it is, because if you think about it,
pharmaceutical companies.
Well, one of the things that is different is the pharmaceutical model has a lot of power and a lot of value, but it comes out of, you start with nothing. You create a molecule, or you derive something from a plant, and you don't have a huge database. So you create it, and you gradually find out the substance in a certain dosage harms people, in a lower dosage it doesn't, and so forth. When you work with psychedelics, you're coming from a massive citizen-generated database. You've already tested, so to speak, lots and lots and lots of variations before you go into, quote, science. So it's not puzzling to me, because there's various cultural and commercial reasons. The same system that is used for unknown substances is applied to well-known substances. And I read a lot of research, and I thought the researcher knew perfectly well what the results were going to be. It was a question of how do you manipulate the system so that those results are pretty much obvious. And that's a fine, I have no quarrel with that, but it's just, I'm not a researcher, I'm a searcher, which means I love discovering things, and other people can then rediscover them, or even, one of the tools that seems to be inappropriately used is a double blind.
Yes. Unfortunately, it's become almost impossible to argue against. It's become a religious belief amongst many doctors.
Exactly.
If it's not being done double blind, it's not true. I mean, it's completely true.
So what I say to people is, if you want to do a double blind on the data that I'm sending you, God bless you. But don't say to me, well, we don't know if it's true because we haven't done a double blind, because that's a religious test.
One thing I want to ask you is that, as you know, we've recovered the kind of insights you had back in the 60s in treating depression with psilocybin. And the problem is not getting people well, but keeping them well. And I'm just wondering whether microdosing might be a viable way of holding people well once they've made that initial recovery. Do you have any experience of it?
There is a very good study in England of depression, psychedelics improving depression. And these were treatment-resistant people. Unfortunately, because it was a laboratory study, when the study was over, they said to everybody, goodbye. The reason I know that, and it's a sad moment, but several of those people came to us and said, we can't, the researchers basically have said, we're done, and we're getting depressed again. And we said, well, you live in England, there's something called fairy caps that proliferate over England. They are a psychedelic mushroom. If you microdose, let us know. And of those 2 people, one of them found that microdosing totally alleviated his depression again, and the other didn't. Okay? Now, neither of those cases ended up back in the researchers' area because that's not good science, and it's terrible humanitarian behavior. So that
it's terrible medicine. I agree.
And again, if we look at depression, in our initial group of maybe 800, maybe 400 or 500 were people who were treatment-resistant depression, because the only people who show up for citizen science microdosing are people for whom antidepressants haven't worked. And even the companies that sell antidepressants say, well, 30% of the people it won't work. But we don't know which 30%, so everybody can take it. Okay, that's a commercial decision. So what we found, and it was startling, is people would say, I'm on my second dose of microdosing. Microdosing is taken every few days. It's not every day. They would say, I'm back. I'm me. And it would be this startling awareness that they were not depressed. Now, no insights, no understanding, no childhood trauma, no whatever depression is caused by, and it's probably like everything else, multiple. They simply were not feeling symptoms. And they found, and again, we had two groups. Remember a woman in the Seattle area who her own depression was alleviated by microdosing. She's a graduate student. And she was so excited that she told a lot of her depressed graduate student friends. And they all reported great improvement. And then she contacted me for the first time. And she said, I have a question. I have two groups of friends. Some of them have said, after microdosing for a month or two, I stopped and my depression is gone. The others said, I need to continue microdosing because my depression comes back when I stop. Now, see, that's a research problem that I find very exciting, and one that as a citizen scientist, there's nothing I can do about it, but I can give it over to people like you, David, and the people that you know, because that's a very curious result, and it may overlap with the people who are not helped by SSRIs, or it may not. But it's a clear scientific problem, and there is the database. And my job is now to hand it over and say, if you're really serious about learning about psychedelics and depression, here's a result that you won't find in any high dose study because you stop too soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd be delighted to take up that challenge. The problem is getting someone to fund it, and there's still. I mean, I find it surprising in the 15 years we've been researching psychedelics, we've only got one grant from the government. Everything else is from philanthropists, despite the fact, we have, discovered what you previously knew, that these are enormously powerful and important drugs.
You and I both know we can at least think of two major governments who, for reasons that aren't even clear to us, and we've spent a lot of time looking at it, somehow turn away from things that improve people's health. It's very puzzling, okay? Because they're not evil. They're not bad people. They're not even necessarily rigid people, but there is something about, well, the nice thing about microdosing is it doesn't scare anyone. If I say, if you microdose, you can maintain your prejudices, your rigidities, your bad relationships. Don't worry. All you'll do is maybe get rid of your depression or recover some of your memory loss or have less joint pain, but you won't have to deal with the large kind of metaphysics that psychedelics force you. Yes. And that may be the difference.
I think you're right. It's a lot of people are still threatened by psychedelics, by the trip, and a lot of doctors are too. A lot of physicians, they believe the lies that they created to justify the ban.
If you had 10 or 12, and you did, if you have 10 or 12 years of medical training, and somebody like me shows up and says, well, if you take this mushroom that grows outside your window and you use it, you can eliminate a great many of the medications. Okay, I'm following a case now, and the person, this is a case of, again, where nobody would ever think of psychedelics for lupus. Okay,
no,
autoimmune disease. Okay, this is a person who was on 14 medications, because the way you handle lupus is symptom, 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 and lupus can have endless symptoms, and not doing well. After a month of microdosing, 8 medications, and most of those with reduced dosage. Now that's worth studying, even if she's the only person in the universe for which that occurs.
Totally. Well, Jim, we've got to change the whole way in which doctors think about evidence and think about the past and get them thinking more about the future.
You and I come, fortunately, from different enough sides that together we can bookend the problem.
Indeed.
And yes, we do. But medicine has done that before. Medicine has made major changes. And curiously, we have an ally that we hadn't thought about, which was greed, which is now, as money is pouring into endless psychedelic companies, the people who they all understand that in order to make massive amounts of money, they have to change the legislation. So they have to first be allowed to make a whole lot of money. And then we know that that a good product actually drives a bad product out of the market. That we don't give people lead and mercury anymore. They have their effects, but we found that there are better things that you can use. So I can.
Well, Jim, it's very clear. Sorry, we've gone over the hour now. I'm going to have to stop you. But look, I think one thing I've learned a lot from you, but the one thing that's really come through, what an optimist you are.
Oh, the alternatives were not as good.
It's been an absolute delight talking to you. I'm sorry it's taken so long for us to talk in the flesh like this, but it's been a great pleasure, and keep up the good work.
Well, thank you, and let us continue to support each other, finding the places in the system where change is being desired and happening, because there are places. And thanks. This was very, very nice for me too.
Super.
Take care.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Well, that's the end of this episode of the Drug Science Podcast. Thank you for listening. But before you go, I would just like to share with you a question from our Drug Science community members. Recently, we recorded a very special podcast episode in which we invited all of our premium and philanthropic community members to ask me anything they like. Their questions were so good, I thought we should include one or two of them at the end of every podcast episode. So please enjoy this new segment of the show. Apologies for the audio quality as we recorded the session over Zoom. Hopefully they're vaguely relevant to what we've been discussing. And if you want to ask me anything, perhaps we could do an Ask David Anything Part 2. Enjoy.
So I'm asking on behalf of Nathan, who's asking a little bit about what evidence is there around CBD oil that's currently available in the UK. And I'm assuming that he means that this is shop bought rather than prescribed. Mm-hmm. So any CBD with no THC content. And personally, he's found that this seems to improve his quality of sleep. However, he's wondering whether this is just a placebo or if it's actually something that he's buying from the shop having an active effect.
So the good thing about the UK, the one thing we got right in the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971 was we said that cannabidiol was not psychoactive, and therefore we're about the only country in the world that kept it legal. Trouble is the populace and the manufacturers had no idea about that until Americans started using cannabidiol, and then they started realizing they could sell it here. So now we've got this huge market of selling cannabidiol. Although there's some uncertainty about whether it's what the real concentrations are and how pure it is, by and large, what's being sold is bioactive. And there's very little doubt now, I think that cannabidiol is not good for sleep. So one of the things we're doing in 2021, we've got 7 separate target diagnoses, and we may expand them. It's pain, and it's anxiety, it's PTSD, it's Tourette's, it's multiple sclerosis, it's drug dependency, it's epilepsy. And we've got separate diagnostic ratings for each of those disorders, but every single patient in 2021 gets a sleep rating and gets what's called a PHQ-9, which is a general rating of quality of life, and the EQ-5. And we're finding the sleep ratings are improving. And cannabidiol, does clearly seem to have a beneficial effect on sleep in different disorders. So I think there's undoubtedly what you're describing seems to make sense to me. Now, in terms of if you're worried about getting a pure, or high quality form, then you could register with 2021, and then you could get it on prescription rather than buying it over the counter. And in fact, you'll probably find it's probably cheaper in 2021.